You open your eyes tonight to a story that feels both surreal and unsettling. A tale where laughter once filled American living rooms, only to be replaced by allegations, courtroom battles, and the kind of betrayal that makes the air heavy. Bill Cosby, once known as America's Dad, stood on the cultural mountaintop, adored for his gentle humor and the fatherly wisdom he dispensed on television. But behind the cardigan sweaters and the wholesome image lay shadows that would eventually break through, piece by piece, until the truth was too loud to ignore. This is not simply the fall of a celebrity, it is the collapse of an icon that shaped childhoods, comforted families, and projected trust, all while carrying accusations that stretched back decades. And here, in the quiet of night, you'll trace that rise and the devastating fall, hearing how America's Dad became something darker, a predator in the eyes of the court and the women who bravely came forward. Welcome to 102 Hours, where the voices of the past whisper through the static and the truth hums just beneath the calm. If you find yourself sinking into this late-night unraveling, don't forget to gently press like to subscribe for more hidden histories and midnight truths, and to leave a comment with your location and local time, because your voice matters here too, in this shared darkness we explore together. In the mid-20th century, Bill Cosby appeared to be the embodiment of an American success story. Born in 1937 in Philadelphia, raised by a mother who encouraged education and a father who struggled with alcoholism, Cosby grew up in public housing. You picture a boy delivering groceries, shining shoes, and making jokes to deflect hardship. A childhood that seemed to sharpen his wit rather than diminish it. By the 1960s, he had broken into stand-up comedy, quickly climbing to fame with a brand of humor that was observational, charming, and notably clean. He didn't need vulgarity. His timing and warmth made audiences lean in, as if he were the wise uncle in the room. This public decency would become part of his brand, setting him apart in a comedy scene crowded with edge and provocation. One of the first major historical facts is his starring role in the groundbreaking series I Spy in 1965. Cosby became the first black actor to co-star in a dramatic television series, winning 3 consecutive Emmy Awards. For many, this was revolutionary. He was a symbol of progress during a turbulent era of civil rights struggles. Kids who watched him saw possibilities for themselves, and adults saw him as proof of American inclusivity on screen. Yet even then, whispers followed him, quiet murmurs in Hollywood circles about behavior that didn't seem to align with the warm persona on camera. And here's a quirky tidbit. Cosby was so respected in the 1970s that he even earned an honorary doctorate in education, despite later controversies over whether his academic contributions truly held merit. He lectured about morality and responsibility, becoming a fixture at graduation ceremonies as if he were the guardian of America's conscience. The irony, in hindsight, feels sharp, as though the public had been handed a lecture from someone living a double life. But the story of Cosby is not simple, and investigators still question whether society itself, captivated by his smiling authority figure, enabled him to go unchecked for so long. Could the myth of America's Dad have blinded both the press and the public to the darker rumors, making them easier to dismiss until it was too late? You sit with that thought in the stillness of the night. For now, this is the beginning. A man rising from poverty, becoming the face of American family life, only to one day be unmasked in the harsh light of accusations and legal consequences. The cardigan is no longer comforting, the laugh track no longer warm. Instead, it's the silence afterward that tells you something was always wrong beneath the performance. Picture the stage lights of a smoky comedy club in the early 1960s. A young Bill Cosby, tall and soft-spoken, is holding the microphone, delivering stories about his childhood, his school days, and even playful sketches about dentists. The audience laughs not because he shocks them, but because he disarms them. You lean in, realizing that this style, gentle, witty, wholesome, was radical in its own quiet way. At a time when comedy was veering into political commentary or bawdy humor, Cosby carved his niche by reminding people of universal family moments. His voice became soothing, familiar, and safe. That was his early charm. He sold the image of decency. By the mid-1960s, Cosby was more than just a comic. He was a pioneer. His breakthrough role on I Spy made him the first black actor to star in a dramatic television series, paired with Robert Culp as a secret agent. Winning 3 consecutive Emmy Awards, he broke barriers for African American actors on mainstream TV. To many, he wasn't just an entertainer, he was a symbol of progress. Proof that television could finally reflect the country's diversity. College campuses invited him to perform, parents welcomed him into their living rooms, and civil rights leaders often pointed to him as an example of cultural advancement. There's something quirky tucked in here too. Cosby didn't just perform comedy albums. He sold them like hotcakes. One of his records, To Russell, My Brother, Whom I Slept With, became one of the best-selling comedy albums of all time. Imagine families gathered around record players in their dens, listening to him describe sibling rivalries and childhood antics. He wasn't just a man telling jokes. He was a man building intimacy with millions of strangers, like a trusted neighbor who made the hardships of life feel softer. But behind this charm, there was a complexity that history now forces you to see differently. Cosby carefully cultivated the persona of a moralist, a man who could scold America about its flaws while embodying its ideals. In interviews, he chastised younger black comedians for using profanity. Later in life, he would deliver his infamous pound cake speech, criticizing African American communities for failing to uphold what he saw as proper values. This moral authority became his mask, shielding him from questions about his personal conduct. Investigators still question whether that carefully curated public image was also his armor, whether the perception of decency made it easier for people to dismiss early whispers of misconduct. Was it possible that Cosby understood the power of reputation so well that he weaponized it, knowing few would challenge the man who seemed to embody America's conscience? As the 1970s arrived, Cosby expanded his empire. He earned a doctorate in education from the University of Massachusetts, writing a dissertation on using Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids as a teaching tool. The show, which premiered in 1972, was both entertaining and moralistic, ending each episode with a clear lesson. Children were told to stay in school, to be kind, to resist peer pressure. For years, families trusted him not only as a performer but as an educator, a voice of guidance. It is easy to see why people referred to him as America's dad, even before The Cosby Show hit prime time. And yet, history whispers differently. Even during this era of family programming and public adoration, a small circle of women claimed Cosby's private behavior didn't match his public teachings. Few listened, fewer reported. For decades, those voices lingered at the margins, drowned out by applause and awards. So, as you sit with this part of the story, you notice the duality forming. On one side, a pioneer, a fatherly figure, a cultural icon who helped dismantle racial barriers in entertainment. On the other, faint warnings, uneasy stories, the quiet tension of contradictions. And in the stillness, you can't help but wonder if the seeds of his downfall were already sprouting, even as his fame was climbing higher than ever. It's the mid-1970s, and the sound of laughter still follows Bill Cosby everywhere he goes. His face beams from television sets, his voice carries across radio programs, and his comedy albums line the shelves of suburban households. To most of America, he is untouchable, a beloved entertainer who embodies respectability and warmth. But beneath that polished veneer, whispers begin to circulate. Quiet, uncomfortable stories exchanged in hushed tones among those who worked near him. You lean into the silence between the punchlines because it is there that the shadow begins to show. Hollywood, even then, was no stranger to rumors. Industry parties where alcohol flowed and deals were whispered over cocktails became part of the fabric of stardom. Cosby was a regular at such gatherings, and some insiders noticed that young women occasionally emerged from his orbit unsettled, shaken, or unwilling to speak about what happened behind closed doors. A quirky detail hides in plain sight. Cosby often traveled with an array of briefcases, reportedly filled with scripts, contracts, and at times strange little bottles of pills he claimed were for personal health. To most, this was unremarkable. Celebrities often carried eccentric items, but later, survivors would recall being offered drinks that tasted odd or pills described as harmless relaxants. Mainstream America didn't hear those whispers. They heard instead the booming success of Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids, the educational cartoon that blended comedy with moral lessons. Children were reminded to resist peer pressure, respect authority, and work hard in school. Cosby's characters told kids not to fall into traps. Yet, investigators still question whether those very lessons were part of a larger disguise, an elaborate construction of virtue that insulated him from suspicion. After all, who would believe dark rumors about the man who had just spent Saturday mornings teaching children not to lie or cheat? As the 1980s dawned, the whispers persisted but rarely pierced the press. In a world before social media, allegations against powerful men often disappeared into sealed settlements or were quietly dismissed as tabloid exaggerations. The culture of silence in Hollywood worked like a well-oiled machine, protecting the stars who sold networks their highest ratings. For Cosby, this silence was golden. His influence was rising, and his name alone could greenlight projects. And here's a curious footnote. In interviews, Cosby sometimes hinted at his fondness for Spanish fly, a supposed aphrodisiac popularized in urban legends. He even joked about it in a 1969 comedy routine, treating the substance as a punchline. At the time, audiences laughed. Few recognized it as a troubling window into behavior that would later be alleged in dozens of testimonies. With hindsight, those jokes no longer sound harmless. They echo like warning signs everyone missed. Still, during these years, the world largely saw him as a role model. Universities awarded him honorary degrees. Corporations sought him for endorsements, believing his wholesome image could sell everything from Jell-O pudding to educational software. He became not just a comedian, but an empire, a trusted figure in households across America. Meanwhile, those early whispers remained trapped in the shadows, building pressure, waiting for the moment they could no longer be ignored. In this fragile space between admiration and accusation, the contradictions of Cosby's life become harder to untangle. Was he simply a man adored by millions, or was he also the man those rumors suggested, shielded by fame and power? The question lingered like static, waiting for someone brave enough to say it aloud. It's 2005 in Pennsylvania, and the mask that Bill Cosby has worn for decades finally begins to crack in public view. Andrea Constand, a staffer at Temple University, where Cosby had once served as a high-profile trustee, steps forward with a story that jolts the carefully protected world of America's dad. She alleges that Cosby invited her to his home the previous year under the guise of career mentorship, offered her pills that he described as herbal supplements, and then assaulted her once she was incapacitated. You picture the scene not as a scandal tabloid splash, but as a quiet, deeply personal nightmare that suddenly collides with the machinery of the legal system. For the first time, Cosby's wholesome public image collides with a criminal accusation too loud to ignore. The case, however, meets resistance almost immediately. Prosecutors in Montgomery County decline to press criminal charges, citing insufficient evidence. For many, this felt like a dead end, another moment where power and influence seem to outweigh the words of a survivor. But Constand doesn't stop. Instead, she files a civil lawsuit, one that will later uncover dozens of other women with strikingly similar stories, accounts that stretch back decades. And here is where the whispers in Hollywood become something else entirely. Documented depositions, public testimony, and a pattern that feels chillingly consistent. A quirky and almost unsettling detail emerges during these proceedings. In a sworn deposition from 2005, Cosby admits to obtaining Quaaludes with the intent of giving them to women he wanted to sleep with. At the time, Quaaludes were notorious as party drugs, their sedative effects sometimes abused for control rather than recreation. To see this admission in black and white strips away some of the ambiguity. Suddenly, jokes about Spanish fly no longer seem harmless, but instead ominously foreshadow what accusers say they endured. Investigators still question whether the prosecutors in 2005 underestimated the weight of that deposition, or whether the legal system itself simply wasn't equipped or willing to move forward against someone of Cosby's stature. After all, here was a man who had been honored at the White House, whose sitcom reruns still played on primetime, and who had positioned himself as a cultural elder. Would a jury in 2005 have believed Andrea Constand over Bill Cosby? That question continues to haunt legal analysts who revisit the case today. Meanwhile, in the background of this civil battle, public opinion begins to fracture. Fans who grew up on The Cosby Show struggle to reconcile their childhood hero with the allegations now spilling into newspapers. Some defend him fiercely, insisting on his innocence. Others start to see the pattern forming and feel betrayed. The civil case itself, settled quietly in 2006 for $338 million, leaves many with unanswered questions. Why pay such a large settlement if nothing happened? Why would so many other women tell eerily similar stories if they were not true? Yet, without a criminal conviction, the legal system leaves the narrative unresolved, for now. But for you, listening in the hush of this midnight retelling, the cracks in Cosby's fortress of reputation are suddenly visible. Andrea Constand's bravery marks the first major public challenge to the myth of America's dad, and though the system initially stalls, her voice does something irreversible. It opens the door for others to be heard. The year is 2006, and the legal storm around Bill Cosby appears to settle with the faintest whisper, not the thunderous crash many expected. Andrea Constand, who had accused him of drugging and assaulting her, agrees to a civil settlement. The figure, $338 million, is staggering, but the silence that follows is even louder. To the outside world, the case vanishes from headlines, tucked away in legal files and confidentiality agreements. You lean into that silence now, because it isn't empty. It's heavy, deliberate, and it shields Cosby's carefully constructed image just long enough for him to keep living as if nothing had happened. The settlement does more than close a lawsuit. It buys time. With criminal charges declined in 2005, Cosby avoids the courtroom spotlight. Television reruns of The Cosby Show continue, endorsements trickle in, and institutions still drape him with honorary degrees. The man once seen as America's dad slips back into the cultural fabric, even as court documents contain troubling admissions, like his acknowledgement of securing Quaaludes for sexual encounters. In hindsight, it feels surreal. Such a revelation should have been explosive, yet in 2006, it remained buried, overshadowed by money and non-disclosure clauses. There's a quirky detail about how hidden this became. At the time, media outlets were largely uninterested in reviving the Constand story. Instead, headlines gushed over Cosby's philanthropy, such as his massive donations to historically black colleges. In 2004, he and his wife pledged $20 million to Spelman College, a gift so large it set records. Universities named buildings after him, presidents shook his hand, and magazines lauded his generosity. To the public eye, Cosby wasn't a man under suspicion. He was a cultural benefactor. The narrative of America's dad remained intact, and yet investigators still question whether this silence, purchased and protected, wasn't just coincidence, but part of a system that allowed powerful men to avoid consequences. How many other accusations never saw daylight because settlements like this one quietly erased them from view? How many opportunities to intervene earlier were lost because money was allowed to take the place of justice? In this moment, Cosby seems to have won. His reputation bruised, but not broken. His legacy intact enough for audiences to keep laughing at his jokes. But when you press deeper, you realize the cracks have already spread beneath the surface. The Constand case may have been silenced in 2006, but those legal papers became a ticking clock. In time, they would resurface in ways that neither Cosby nor his defenders could ever fully control. For now, though, the cardigan is still cozy, the pudding commercials still air, and the smiling patriarch persona keeps shining. But you can feel the pause between heartbeats, the waiting storm. The settlement isn't the end. It is the uneasy calm before, a cultural reckoning that will shake the ground beneath him. It's 2014, nearly a decade after Andrea Constand's settlement, and Bill Cosby is still embraced in some circles as a cultural treasure. His stand-up tours draw loyal crowds, reruns of The Cosby Show remain staples of family television, and his name still carries weight in academic and philanthropic spaces. Then, almost overnight, that carefully preserved image begins to crumble. A single voice ignites what becomes an avalanche. Comedian Hannibal Buress, during a performance in Philadelphia, calls Cosby out bluntly, labeling him a predator and urging audiences to Google Bill Cosby rape. The line isn't part of a prepared national exposé. It was an offhand remark in a comedy routine. But it sticks, spreading across social media like wildfire. You imagine the whispers that once floated through back rooms now amplified, echoing on every timeline. The public begins to look again. Old stories resurface, new voices join the chorus, and suddenly dozens of women step forward, recounting chillingly similar experiences. Drinks spiked, pills offered as relaxants, waking up in confusion and fear. Cosby's image as America's dad doesn't just fracture, it shatters. Networks pull reruns of The Cosby Show, universities rescind honorary degrees, and once loyal fans confront the betrayal of a man they had welcomed into their homes. Here is a quirky and somewhat eerie footnote. One of Cosby's comedy routines from decades earlier joked about Spanish fly, the supposed aphrodisiac that could render women pliable. In the past, audiences laughed. But revisited in the light of these allegations, the bit sounds like a confession hiding in plain sight. Jokes once dismissed as harmless suddenly feel like smoke from a fire everyone had ignored. Investigators still question whether the cultural reckoning of the Me Too era could have happened earlier if those whispers in Hollywood and Constand's 2005 civil case hadn't been muffled by settlements and silence. Would the flood of allegations in 2014 have seemed so shocking if the system had acted on red flags nearly a decade before? Or was society itself complicit, choosing the comfort of America's dad over the discomfort of facing America's predator? By now, the accusations number more than 50. The sheer volume is staggering. Each account carries unique details, but the patterns are hauntingly familiar. And for you, listening tonight, it's impossible not to feel the magnitude of betrayal. This isn't just a fall from grace. It is a collapse so complete that it redefines what betrayal by a cultural icon looks like. The cardigan sweaters, the fatherly smiles, the moral lectures, all of it feels like a stage set, masking a very different story playing out behind closed doors. It's June 2017, and after years of swirling accusations, the first criminal trial against Bill Cosby begins in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. The world watches as Andrea Constand steps into the courtroom. No longer just a name in legal filings, but a determined survivor facing down one of the most famous men in America. You can almost feel the hush of that courtroom, the weight of expectation pressing against every seat. For the prosecution, this is not just about one woman's account. It's about showing a pattern of behavior stretching across decades. For the defense, it's about dismantling credibility, about turning the public's beloved father figure into a victim of opportunism. The trial becomes a media circus. Headlines flood every corner of the internet, and news vans clog the courthouse steps. Constand testifies, describing in measured detail how Cosby gave her pills that made her dizzy and incapacitated, then violated her while she was unable to resist. The jury listens, stone-faced. Outside, protesters and supporters collide, their voices mingling into a strange mix of outrage and loyalty. Cosby, once untouchable, now sits at the defendant's table, his cardigan replaced by a suit and a frail composure. A quirky detail punctuates these tense days. Cosby is often seen arriving at court carrying a cane, sometimes cracking jokes to reporters waiting outside. On one occasion, he even raised his hand in a mock salute, as if to remind the public of his entertainer's charm. The gesture struck some as gallows humor, others as denial, but it revealed his instinct to perform even when the stage was a courtroom. Still, investigators question whether the prosecution had enough. Much of the case hinges on Constand's credibility and the testimony of one other woman allowed to speak about her similar experience. Without physical evidence, the prosecution leans heavily on patterns and consistency. The defense hammers at timelines, contradictions, and motivations, urging jurors to doubt. After 6 days of deliberations, the jury remains hopelessly deadlocked. 11 days of testimony, 52 hours of debate, and still no verdict. The judge declares a mistrial, and Cosby walks out of the courthouse, neither convicted nor acquitted, but free. The air feels thick with frustration. Survivors who had hoped for justice are left stunned, while Cosby's team proclaims victory. The mistrial doesn't close the book, it simply places a bookmark in a story too large to vanish. For you, listening in the dim quiet of this hour, the mistrial feels like a pause in a nightmare. Justice hasn't been denied outright, but it hasn't been delivered either. And yet, beneath the disappointment, there's a shift. The whispers have become testimony. The silence has become headlines, and the world can no longer pretend not to hear. The next chapter is already waiting, and the storm is far from over. April 2018 arrives, bringing with it a second criminal trial for Bill Cosby, this time with a sharper focus and more extensive testimony. You can almost hear the courtroom's tension, the quiet hum of anticipation as journalists, legal experts, and the public converge to witness what many have called a historic reckoning. Cosby, now 80 years old, faces 3 counts of aggravated indecent assault. This trial isn't just about one incident. It symbolizes decades of silenced voices finally gaining space to speak. You feel the weight of history pressing in, as if every laugh track and every rerun of The Cosby Show now carries a shadow that the courtroom lights cannot erase. Andrea Constand testifies again, recounting the events of 2004 with painstaking detail. Her voice steady, unwavering, a stark contrast to the laughter and warmth Cosby once commanded. Other accusers, some who had never gone public before, step forward, weaving a chilling pattern. Similar methods, similar locations, a calculated approach that investigators and jurors alike cannot ignore. The prosecution meticulously presents these accounts to demonstrate consistency, emphasizing that these weren't isolated incidents but part of a repeated behavior. A quirky yet telling tidbit emerges during cross-examination. Cosby, once a master of timing and audience engagement, stumbles over simple questions, fumbling words in a courtroom devoid of humor. The contrast is jarring. The man who once controlled laughter with a single pause now struggles to control the narrative about his own actions. You sense the power shift. The stage has changed, and the audience, jury, public, and survivors alike, holds the spotlight. Investigators still question whether the sheer number of accusers and the breadth of their testimony created a turning point that earlier proceedings could not. Could the court have overlooked patterns if the accusers had been fewer, or had social media not amplified the climate of awareness? The question lingers as the trial unfolds, a reminder of the complex interplay between law, culture, and timing. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberates. This time, the outcome is different. Cosby is found guilty on all 3 counts of aggravated indecent assault. The courtroom reacts with muted shock and relief. For many survivors, it is a moment of justice, a long-awaited acknowledgement that their voices matter. Cosby's decades-long image as America's dad lies in tatters, replaced by the label of convicted predator. Outside the courtroom, reporters scramble to cover the verdict, and the nation collectively grapples with the unsettling reality that a cultural icon can hide darkness behind a familiar, comforting smile. For you, sitting in the quiet of your room, the impact is visceral. The laughter once tied to Cosby's name now carries echoes of betrayal. The cardigan, the jokes, the fatherly advice, all remnants of a narrative that has crumbled in the face of truth. And while the legal system has delivered a verdict, the emotional and cultural reckoning is only just beginning. September 2018 arrives with the weight of consequence. Bill Cosby, convicted on 3 counts of aggravated indecent assault, faces sentencing that will formally define him in the legal system as more than a former television star. He will now be labeled a sexually violent predator. You feel the tension of the courthouse that day, the air thick with anticipation as Cosby, once the comforting presence in millions of homes, confronts a reality that no script or punchline can soften. His once celebrated persona is stripped down to legal definitions, court documents, and stark testimony from survivors. The judge sentences Cosby to 3 to 10 years in state prison, mandating registration as a sex offender and imposing a $25,000 fine. The verdict sends ripples far beyond Montgomery County. Media outlets cover every facet, from the courtroom reactions to the public shock that someone so beloved could be convicted. Families who once embraced his image of moral guidance are left grappling with dissonance, reconciling fond memories with the emerging truth. You imagine sitting in living rooms across America, flipping through TV channels, hearing the same name you trusted so completely now tied to criminality and betrayal. Here's a quirky, almost surreal detail. During sentencing, Cosby's legal team presents a series of character witnesses, including fellow comedians and former co-stars, who attempt to speak to his generosity, philanthropy, and decades-long career. Their testimonies, intended to humanize him, create an odd juxtaposition. A man both revered and reviled, one moment eliciting nostalgia, the next triggering horror. The contrast underscores the challenge of separating public persona from private behavior, a question investigators still ponder in similar high-profile cases today. Despite the sentence, debates swirl about fairness, proportionality, and precedent. Some argue that the punishment is appropriate for decades of alleged abuse finally addressed in court. Others contend that Cosby's age and health complicate the ethics of imprisonment. Investigators still question whether the focus on his celebrity status influenced both the jury's decision and public perception. Could an average man, less known, have received the same attention, scrutiny, or judgment? Or did fame amplify consequences that might otherwise have been less dramatic? By now, the cultural reckoning has taken root. Cosby is no longer America's dad in any meaningful sense. The man who once symbolized warmth, humor, and family values has been redefined by the law and by the voices of survivors. For you, hearing this, it's impossible not to feel the weight of betrayal layered over decades of admiration. The cardigan sweaters and gentle laughter are now visual echoes of a person whose actions contradict everything he once represented. And while the public absorbs this reality, the wheels of legal appeal are already turning. The narrative isn't static. It will continue to evolve, testing both the legal system and the collective understanding of trust, fame, and accountability. This is a man sentenced, yes, but the story of consequences, both public and personal, is far from over. June 30th, 2021, becomes a day that shocks the nation. Bill Cosby, once imprisoned and labeled a sexually violent predator, is suddenly released from prison. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court overturns his conviction, ruling that his due process rights were violated because a previous promise from a former prosecutor had assured him he would not face criminal charges in the Constand case. You can almost feel the disbelief coursing through courtrooms, living rooms, and social media feeds alike. A man who had served nearly 3 years behind bars walks free, leaving survivors, legal experts, and the public to grapple with the complex intersection of law, ethics, and celebrity. The court's decision hinges on procedural technicalities, not on a reassessment of guilt or innocence. Cosby's defense argued, and the Supreme Court agreed, that he relied on the former district attorney's non-prosecution assurance when he gave testimony in a civil deposition, testimony that was later used against him in the criminal case. It's a subtle but critical distinction, one that speaks to the legal system's obligation to honor agreements, even in cases of public outrage. Investigators still question whether this technicality diminishes the real-world impact of the crimes alleged, or whether it highlights a gap in how the justice system protects both defendants' rights and survivors' voices. A quirky and almost surreal detail emerges in the aftermath. Cosby is photographed leaving the prison in a crisp suit, appearing calm, even composed. Social media buzzes with memes and commentary, blending incredulity, humor, and outrage. Some remember the cardigan, the laugh track, the comforting image of America's dad. Now, those symbols feel twisted, almost ironic, as a man once convicted struts free under the warm sunlight of legal technicality. The public reaction is deeply polarized. Some see the release as a miscarriage of justice, a betrayal of the women who testified, and of the broader movement demanding accountability. Others interpret it as the triumph of constitutional protections, an affirmation that even the most vilified defendants are entitled to fair process. Meanwhile, Cosby himself largely retreats from the spotlight, giving few public statements. You feel the tension. Freedom in one sense, yet legacy irrevocably tarnished in another. For survivors, the release does not erase their experiences. The cultural reckoning that began with whispers, erupted in lawsuits, and culminated in trials does not vanish. Cosby's name remains indelibly associated with abuse, betrayal, and controversy. Yet the legal system reminds us that the path from accusation to conviction to finality is often neither simple nor satisfying. And for you, the listener, the story underscores a chilling truth. Law, fame, and morality do not always align neatly, leaving society to wrestle with contradictions that feel both urgent and unresolved. The year 2022 adds another layer to Bill Cosby's complicated post-prison life. While he may have been freed from criminal liability, the civil system continued to hold him accountable. Judy Huth, who alleged that Cosby sexually assaulted her as a minor in the 1970s, pursues her case through civil court. This civil verdict brings into sharp relief the tension between criminal and civil justice. Cosby's criminal conviction was vacated due to procedural technicalities, but the civil judgment operates under a lower burden of proof, preponderance of the evidence, rather than beyond a reasonable doubt. For the public and survivors alike, this distinction can feel both comforting and frustrating, highlighting the nuanced ways the law addresses misconduct. Investigators still question whether high-profile civil cases like this one can fully compensate for the emotional and cultural impact of crimes that are decades old. A quirky detail emerges from the trial. Huth's attorneys presented a photograph of her at a young age alongside Cosby, juxtaposing innocence with predation in a way that resonates more powerfully than words alone. The image, now widely discussed in media coverage, captures the visual symbolism of a life altered by abuse, reminding audiences that these are not abstract allegations, but deeply personal violations. Meanwhile, Cosby maintains a near-total retreat from public life. Interviews are rare and appearances are almost non-existent. Legal battles, reputational collapse, and public scrutiny leave him largely isolated. To the casual observer, he is a man who has lost everything beyond freedom. His celebrity, his endorsements, his status as a moral authority. Yet, paradoxically, he remains a household name, a figure whose story is now inseparable from the broader discourse on sexual misconduct, accountability, and cultural hypocrisy. For you, the listener, this chapter is sobering. It underscores the idea that justice is not always linear, nor is it complete. Some accountability is delivered in civil court even when criminal avenues fail, yet the cultural scars remain. Cosby's narrative, once about laughter and fatherly guidance, now exists as a cautionary tale, a lens through which to examine how society venerates icons, overlooks warning signs, and slowly awakens to uncomfortable truths that have been decades in the making. Today, Bill Cosby lives a life that feels almost spectral, a shadow of the man who once commanded admiration across the nation. He resides largely in isolation, rarely seen in public, and his legacy is a complex tangle of entertainment, philanthropy, and betrayal. You can imagine the quiet streets of suburban Pennsylvania or the gated entrances of his private properties. Places once bustling with visitors, now hushed, the echoes of past laughter replaced by the weight of public scrutiny. The contrast between the image America loved and the actions alleged and proven cannot be overstated. The same man who taught children moral lessons now represents a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power. His career, once glittering with Emmy Awards, stand-up accolades, and groundbreaking television achievements, is now inseparable from the allegations, lawsuits, and convictions that followed. The Cosby Show, which once painted a portrait of familial warmth and racial progress, is now often discussed through a lens of irony and betrayal. Networks continue to wrestle with whether to air reruns. Streaming services have removed the show from their catalogs. Cosby's cultural influence has not disappeared entirely, but it is forever shadowed, a dual legacy of artistic achievement and moral failure. A quirky, almost surreal note in this aftermath is how memes and online discourse have taken over the narrative in the digital age. From satirical commentary to social media hashtags, Cosby's story is dissected, mocked, and analyzed endlessly online. It is a reminder that in the modern era, public perception is shaped not only by courtrooms or newsrooms but by millions of digital voices, and each contributing to the rewriting of a legacy once thought untouchable. Investigators still question whether the long delay between initial allegations and public accountability allowed Cosby to evade consequences for too long. Did fame, wealth, and the carefully constructed persona of America's dad shield him from scrutiny that other men might not have escaped? And more broadly, what does his story reveal about society's complicity in overlooking warning signs when they conflict with comforting narratives? These questions linger, as uncomfortable and persistent as the memory of a beloved figure's betrayal. As the night draws in and you sit with this story, you realize that Bill Cosby is both a product and a reflection of a culture that celebrated charisma over caution. His life, now defined more by accusation and legal battles than by laughter, serves as a haunting reminder of the distance between public image and private actions. And though decades of adoration cannot be fully erased, they cannot shield him from the enduring judgment of history, survivors, and an awakened public. After decades of laughter, applause, and admiration, the story of Bill Cosby concludes not in bright lights or celebratory fanfare, but in quiet reflection and the sobering reality of accountability. For you, listening now, the contrast between the warm, reassuring image of America's dad and the revelations that followed serves as a cautionary tale about trust, fame, and the facades people can maintain. It is a reminder that public persona, no matter how comforting or familiar, can conceal truths that the world may initially overlook. The laughter that once echoed through living rooms now carries the weight of unease, a subtle reminder to question appearances and honor the voices of those who have been silenced. Yet within this darkness, there is also a glimmer of resilience. The courage of Andrea Constand and the dozens of women who came forward illustrates the power of truth, persistence, and courage, even in the face of a seemingly untouchable figure. Their willingness to speak, To pursue justice and to withstand public scrutiny demonstrates that accountability, however delayed, is possible. For society, the Cosby saga underscores the importance of vigilance, awareness, and the moral responsibility to listen to survivors, even when it challenges cherished narratives. In the end, this story is both personal and cultural, a meditation on the complexities of human behavior, celebrity, and the law. It reminds you that legends can falter, that innocence can be betrayed, and that history, when examined with care and honesty, can illuminate uncomfortable truths. And as you close your eyes tonight, allow the story to settle gently. A quiet lesson about trust, integrity, and the consequences of actions hidden in plain sight.